The town of Mapleford had always lived inside a quiet bubble, the kind of place where the biggest events were school fairs, small parades, or the occasional lost dog notice taped onto the front of the grocery store. Crime was something people joked about because it never really happened. Residents often said they could leave their doors unlocked and nothing would go missing except a loaf of bread if a neighborhood kid was hungry. That peaceful world shattered on a cold October evening when the police received a frantic call from a hiker near Black Pine Lake. His voice trembled as he explained he had stumbled upon a man lying motionless on the ground, his skin pale as the moonlight filtering through the trees. Officers responded quickly, though they already sensed trouble. Black Pine Lake, though beautiful, had always carried an eerie feeling with its thick trees, fog-covered water, and narrow trails. When the officers arrived, the hiker pointed silently toward a small clearing. There, lying face down on a bed of orange and brown leaves, was a body. The air around the man felt strangely still, almost heavy, as if the forest itself understood that something terrible had happened. When they carefully turned the body over, flashlights revealed bruises along the jawline and a deep cut on the side of the head. The victim's clothes were neat but slightly wrinkled, as if he had been grabbed or handled before being placed there. The man's hair was wet even though the ground was completely dry, and the leaves beneath him remained perfectly undisturbed. That detail alone made the officers exchange uneasy glances. It was the kind of scene that looked staged, too clean, too quiet. Back at the station, it didn't take long to identify the victim. His name was Daniel Rourke, a 42-year-old accountant who lived in a small apartment near the center of town. His neighbors described him as polite but distant, the type of man who nodded instead of waving and smiled without ever showing teeth. He worked long hours, kept to himself, and rarely left town except for shopping trips. No one could imagine him caught up in anything dangerous, let alone made it. As more officers arrived at the lake, the details grew stranger. Daniel's pockets were empty. His wallet, phone, and watch were gone. On the surface, it looked like a robbery that had escalated into violence. But the officers found no footprints other than the hikers and their own. No broken branches. No drag marks. No signs of a struggle. It was as if Daniel had simply appeared there out of thin air. The medical examiner later confirmed what the officers suspected. Daniel had died from a single, powerful blow to the head. He had no defensive wounds. No cuts on his hands. No broken nails from fighting back. He hadn't run. He hadn't struggled. He hadn't even seen the attack coming. It was quick, silent, and efficient. The kind of killing that took only seconds. When the news reached Mapleford the next morning, the town felt the shock like a sudden storm. People who barely knew Daniel whispered about him in grocery aisles and at the post office. Parents kept their children indoors for a few days, worried that a murderer might still be lurking around. The local newspaper printed a rare front-page alert, calling it a tragedy at Black Pine Lake. The mayor held a short press conference promising justice and urging calm, but even his voice shook slightly as he spoke. A week later, Daniel's funeral took place. It was small, almost painfully so. Only a handful of co-workers came, along with 2 neighbors and the town librarian, who admitted she barely knew him but felt it was the right thing to do. No family members showed up. The pastor read a short message about life being fragile and unpredictable. The coffin lowered slowly into the ground while a chilly wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Those who attended walked away feeling a strange emptiness, not because they had known Daniel well, but because the whole situation felt incomplete, like a book missing its final chapters. Detective Laura Price couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the case. She had worked in Mapleford long enough to know that people rarely got murdered without leaving behind some clue, some footprint, some mistake. But Daniel's death was eerily clean. It bothered her more than she let on. She reviewed the evidence repeatedly, looking for anything she might have missed. The wet hair, the dry ground, the lack of footprints, the missing belongings, the single precise blow. It didn't feel like a random robbery. It didn't feel impulsive. It felt planned. And it felt personal. But there was nothing else to work with. No fingerprints. No witnesses. No security cameras near the lake. Eventually the case grew cold, sitting on Laura's desk like a heavy reminder of failure. Life in Mapleford returned to its usual slow pace. Fall turned into winter. Snow covered the lake and the forest, hiding whatever secrets the ground had held. People stopped talking about the murder as new concerns filled their lives. The early freeze, the rising cost of heating, the approaching holidays. Time moved forward, as it always did. But the story of Daniel Rourke never truly left the town's memory. It lingered in the back of people's minds, a reminder that even peaceful places held shadows. Months passed. New stories came and went. Children played in the streets again. The local bakery reopened after repairs. Life appeared normal. Yet something strange and unseen was already beginning to stir beneath the surface. Because Mapleford believed Daniel Rourke was gone forever. They believed they had buried him. They believed the nightmare had ended. They had no idea how wrong they were. Only the trees around Blackpine Lake knew the truth. The unsettling truth that this was not the end of Daniel's story at all. It was only the first chapter. The first death. And the second one would change everything the town thought it understood about life, identity, and the shadows that walked beside us. Daniel Rourke was dead. Everyone agreed on that. But Mapleford was about to witness something impossible. Something unexplainable. Something terrifying. Because a man believed to be buried was about to be seen walking again. And no one was prepared for what followed. 2 months had passed since Daniel Rourke's quiet funeral, and Mapleford had slowly returned to its usual calm. The lake trail reopened, families went back to their weekend picnics, and teenagers once again dared each other to walk through the woods at night. The murder that had shaken the town began to fade into rumor, the kind people whispered about only when the sky turned dark or when the wind made the trees creak. Most residents wanted to forget that something so violent had happened in their peaceful town. But forgetting wasn't going to be an option, not after what happened next. It started with a single phone call to the police station. A woman named Ellen Marsh, a retired schoolteacher known for her honesty, called in early one morning, her voice trembling with confusion more than fear. She explained she had seen a man walking across Hartley Bridge just before sunrise. At first she hadn't paid attention, as she often went for dawn walks, but as the man passed under a street lamp, she recognized his face. She insisted it was Daniel Rourke. The officer taking the call tried not to sound dismissive, but he had heard strange sightings before. Grief, memory, and morning fog could play tricks on anyone. He told her they would look into it, though he didn't believe for a second she had actually seen a dead man walking. But the next day, more reports came in. A gas station clerk on the edge of town claimed a man who looked exactly like Daniel had come in around midnight, bought cigarettes, and left quickly without saying a word. The clerk remembered him clearly because he recognized the scar above the man's right eyebrow, a small but distinct mark Daniel had been known for. The clerk even swore the man's hands were shaking slightly as he counted the cash. Again, police brushed it off as a mistaken identity, but the number of sightings increased. A teenager riding his bike late at night said he saw Daniel standing at the bus stop near the post office. A delivery driver reported seeing him entering a small pharmacy 30 minutes before closing. None of the reports matched in exact details, but all shared the same strange certainty. They all believed they had seen Daniel. Detective Laura Price initially dismissed these claims as grief-driven imagination. Mapleford was small. People talked. Stories spread fast, especially strange ones. Yet part of her felt uneasy. She knew the face people described. Sharp jawline, narrow nose, a scar above the brow. It wasn't a common combination. The sightings might have been mistakes, but the pattern gnawed at her. Laura finally took the reports seriously when they obtained security footage from the pharmacy. She and 2 other officers sat inside the dimly lit viewing room at the station as the video played. The timestamp showed the man entering at 11:42 p.m. He wore dark jeans and a hoodie with the hood pulled halfway up, but when he passed under the fluorescent light near the counter, the camera captured a clear angle of his face. Laura froze. The room fell silent. It was Daniel. Same thin lips. Same expressionless stare. Same scar. If someone else resembled him this closely, it would have been a new perfect twin. But Daniel had no siblings. According to his records, he had been an only child. According to his records, he had been alive. And according to his records, he was now dead. Laura played the footage again and again until she memorized every frame. The man walked with a slight limp, something Daniel had never shown in life. He kept his eyes low, avoiding the camera but not well enough to hide. He paid in cash and left the store without speaking to anyone. Laura visited the pharmacy to talk to the staff, but the cashier working that night remembered almost nothing. He only recalled the man's silence and the feeling that something was off about him, though he couldn't explain what. Laura took the footage home in her mind, unable to sleep. She needed answers, and the only place to get them was Daniel's apartment. It had remained untouched since his death except for a brief search after the funeral. No one had been inside since. Also, everyone believed. When Laura stepped into the apartment building the next morning, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and dust. Daniel's apartment door was still sealed with a police sticker. The lock looked undamaged. Everything seemed normal. But once she stepped inside, her instincts told her otherwise. Dust covered most surfaces, but several areas were strangely clean. Someone had wiped the counter. Someone had used the kitchen sink recently. When Laura opened the trash bin, she found food wrappers dated within the last 10 days. A water bottle half full sat on the small table beside the sofa. The refrigerator contained a carton of eggs with only one missing and a loaf of bread that couldn't have been more than a week old. Her pulse quickened. Someone was living here. Someone who knew the layout, the routine, and the habits of the man who once lived in this space. But Daniel's utilities had been shut off shortly after his death. The electricity was only on because the building paid for the hallway and emergency power. The water supply, however, should have been restricted to basic flow. Laura opened the bathroom door and noticed streaks on the mirror, as if someone had wiped it after a shower. The air still carried a faint scent of soap. She checked the bedroom. Someone had slept on the bed recently. The blanket was slightly wrinkled, the pillow indented. Panic and confusion mixed in her chest. She stepped back out into the hallway and knocked on the neighbor's door. A middle-aged man in thick glasses opened it hesitantly. When Laura asked if he had heard anything unusual, the man nodded slowly. He explained that for weeks he had heard footsteps next door. Soft ones. Late at night. Sometimes around 2 a.m. Sometimes around 3. He had assumed it was the landlord or an officer checking the apartment, so he never complained. A woman in the apartment across the hall admitted she had heard someone open and close the door several times, but when she peeked through the peephole, she never caught anyone. She assumed she had simply been too slow. Laura's heart pounded. None of her officers had been inside. The landlord had not entered. No one on record had visited. Someone was secretly living in Daniel's home. Someone who moved quietly, almost like a shadow. Someone who came and went without being seen. Someone who looked exactly like a dead man. Laura returned to the station and reopened Daniel's case file. She stared at his autopsy report, the photographs, the burial papers. Everything stated clearly that the man found at Black Pine Lake was Daniel Rourke. But if that was true, who was walking around town wearing his face? The more she thought about it, the more the hairs on her arms stood upright. There was a question rising in her mind that she didn't want to say out loud, a question that felt dangerous. But it pushed its way to the safest anyway. What if they had buried the wrong man? That night, as she sat alone in her office, reviewing the evidence for the 100th time, she felt a chill run along her spine. The town believed Daniel Rourke was gone. The grave in the Mapleford Cemetery said he was dead. The report on her desk confirmed it. Yet the man on the security footage was real. The fresh trash in his apartment was real. The footsteps neighbors heard were real. Someone was out there. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Someone with Daniel's face. Someone who had returned from the dead. Or someone pretending to be him so perfectly it didn't seem possible. Either way, Mapleford's peace had been broken again. And this time, the mystery would only grow deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. Detective Laura Price spent the next few days drowning in paperwork, witness statements, and security footage, yet none of it brought her closer to an answer. The mystery of Daniel Rourke only deepened with every passing hour. If the dead man found at Black Pine Lake was really Daniel, then who was walking around town? And if the walking man was Daniel, then who had been buried? The questions twisted in her mind like vines, growing thicker and harder to cut through. She decided she needed to understand Daniel's life better. Not the surface-level facts she already knew, but the hidden corners, the parts no one had ever bothered to look at before. When she first pulled Daniel's file months earlier, it had looked ordinary. He was a quiet accountant, steady job, clean background, a simple life. But simple lives were rarely simple. Laura returned to his workplace, a small accounting firm with old carpets and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. Daniel's co-workers remembered him as distant, polite, and private. He never joined office gatherings. He never talked about his past. Two of them said he often left work early on certain Fridays, claiming he had appointments. One remembered he sometimes returned on Monday looking tired, like he hadn't slept. None of this was helpful until one employee named Kevin mentioned something odd. He said Daniel received large envelopes in the mail every month, always with no return address. They were thick, sealed tightly, and he never opened them at work. Instead, he slipped them into his briefcase and left immediately after. Laura wrote this detail down, sensing it mattered. She then visited the bank to request Daniel's financial records, which required a special warrant. When she finally obtained it, she sat down with the documents in a quiet interview room. The more she read, the more her stomach tightened. Daniel's main account showed typical transactions: rent, groceries, utilities, small purchases. But then there were repeated withdrawals of large amounts of cash, always around the same date each month. The cash simply vanished. Daniel never deposited it anywhere else. He never spent it locally. It was as if he was paying someone, or funding something, or disappearing into another life periodically. Then she noticed a second account. It was under a slightly different spelling, Daniel Rourke. Such a small change someone could easily overlook, but the birth date and ID number were identical. This second account received deposits from a business called Northbridge Holdings. Laura tried searching for it online, but nothing concrete appeared. No website, no business listing, nothing at all. It was a ghost company. Her heart pounded as she realized Daniel had been receiving untraceable money for years. Why would a quiet accountant in Mapleford need a second secret account? Why would he hide money under a fake name? And why had none of this come up earlier? She returned to the police archives and checked deeper records. Daniel's background was almost too clean, too basic, as if someone had wiped away everything that mattered. No school records before age 15. No medical records. No family history except a vague mention of parents who reportedly died in a car accident decades ago. Something didn't add up. A man living a perfectly ordinary life doesn't build a second identity unless he's hiding something. But what? Laura's next discovery came from a rental storage facility near the industrial district. She had traced a partial address linked to the second bank account. Using another warrant, she forced entry into a small storage unit at the far end of the property. The moment she stepped inside, the truth began to unfold in ways she hadn't expected. Inside the unit were metal shelves filled with items that did not belong to an accountant. There were passports, 8 of them, each with a different name but all bearing Daniel's face. Some were from countries he had never visited, according to his public records. There were stacks of foreign currency neatly packed in elastic bands. Maps of cities she didn't recognize were pinned to a corkboard. And on a small table sat a satellite phone with a dead battery. A chill crawled down her spine. Daniel had lived a life far more complex than anyone in Mapleford had imagined. This wasn't the behavior of an accountant. It looked like the hidden world of someone involved in intelligence, espionage, or organized crime. But which? And why? She found a locked metal box in the corner. After a long struggle and help from a maintenance worker, she pried it open. Inside was a folder marked with the same name she had seen on the bank records, Northbridge Holdings. The papers inside were coded, filled with strange symbols and phrases that made no sense. Others listed unfamiliar names and locations, almost like targets or contacts. None of the pages indicated Daniel's role, but the message was clear. He had been involved with something dangerous. Laura felt a growing heaviness, realizing she was now part of something bigger than a simple murder case. She closed the folder slowly and took a deep breath. If Daniel had been working for a secret organization, what did they want from him? What had he done for them? Why was he paid through an untraceable account? And the most frightening question, was his death connected to whatever dangerous world he had been part of? As she drove back to the station, her mind raced faster than the car. She felt a strange mix of dread and excitement. She had cracked open a secret, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for where it led. She reviewed everything she knew so far and realized she didn't actually know Daniel at all. His neighbor said he didn't socialize, but maybe that was intentional. His co-workers said he avoided personal questions. Maybe that was a skill. His clean background looked too clean. Maybe it had been manufactured. Mapleford had always seen Daniel as an invisible man, someone who blended into the town so quietly that no one paid attention to his life. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Daniel had built his life around not being noticed. But then why had his double, if that's what the walking man was, returned to Mapleford after the funeral? Why risk being seen? Why show up at his own apartment? Why return to a life he had already abandoned? Or perhaps the better question was, who was the real Daniel? The one who had lived quietly in Mapleford, or the one connected to foreign currencies, fake passports, and coded documents? That night, Laura spread the passports and files across her office desk, studying each one. One passport listed him as a consultant. Another said he was a charity worker. Another identified him as a businessman from Toronto. These weren't disguises. These were full identities, each carefully constructed and believable. Only a professional could build something like this. Laura's heart beat faster as she pieced the story together. Daniel wasn't just hiding. He was running. And perhaps he had been running for years. Every new discovery brought her one step closer to understanding the man behind the mystery, but also one step closer to danger. She knew she needed to confront the possibility that Daniel's death wasn't random. It might have been planned. It might have been retaliation. Or it might have been a mistake. Not a mistake by Daniel, but by someone who wanted him gone. As the hours passed, Laura could no longer pretend this was a normal case. Something dark lived underneath Mapleford's quiet surface, and Daniel Rourke had been part of it. She looked at his photograph, one from his old work ID, and studied his eyes. They were distant, almost hollow, like someone carrying a lifetime of secrets. Finally she whispered to herself, "Who are you really, Daniel?" But the silence of the room didn't answer. All she knew for certain was that Daniel had lived a double life. A hidden life. A dangerous life. And whatever he had been part of was far from over. Because someone was walking around Mapleford wearing his face. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Someone who held the next piece of the truth. Night had settled over the city like a heavy coat, thick and suffocating, and the streets outside the precinct glimmered with puddles that reflected the flickering neon signs. Detective Armand sat alone in the dimly lit interrogation room, the metallic hum of the overhead light vibrating through the silence. His fingers drummed against the cold steel table as he replayed everything that had happened over the past 48 hours. Every clue he had uncovered felt like it led him deeper into a maze, and every step forward only revealed two new dead ends. The case was evolving faster than he could contain it, shifting shape like something alive. He had always trusted evidence more than people, but this time even the evidence seemed to be lying. The door creaked open and Officer Ruffy entered, his face pale and his hands gripping a folder so tightly the edges were crumpled. Armand didn't need to ask. He could sense when news was bad before a word was spoken. Ruffy set the folder on the table, his eyes avoiding Armand's. "We ran the new fingerprints," he whispered. "They don't match the suspect. They don't match anyone in the system." Armand felt his stomach drop. The prints had been found at the one location that should have finally given them leverage, the abandoned factory on the edge of the industrial district. The place was practically a graveyard of rusted machinery and forgotten crimes. They had expected to find confirmation of the suspect who had been their prime lead since day one. Instead, they had uncovered a new ghost. Armand opened the folder and stared at the photographs inside. The prints were clean, precise, captured on a broken shard of glass near the back wall. Whoever left them had been careful, but not careful enough. The problem was that the suspect profile they'd been building no longer made sense. If someone else had been at the factory before the killing, then they were looking at a second player, one who had slipped beneath every radar. Ruffy shifted uncomfortably. "There's more," he said. "We checked the surveillance feeds from the gas station across the road. Someone erased the footage." Armand raised an eyebrow. "Erased? As in tampered with?" Ruffy nodded. "Professionally. Not Junker-level tampering. Someone who knows what they are doing." The implications cracked open the case in a new, unsettling way. Armand leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to assemble the shadows into a coherent form. Someone was watching them. Someone who had been one step ahead since the beginning. That meant the killer wasn't acting alone. Or Weiss, the killer wasn't the one they were chasing at all. He stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the tile floor. "Get the team ready," he said. If the factory wasn't the crime scene, then it was a message. He headed toward the operations room, where a digital map of the city glowed across an entire wall. Pins, strings, photographs, an attempt to organize chaos. The others gathered around as he approached, their faces weary but alert. "We've been treating that factory like it's the place where it happened," Armand began, gesturing toward the map. "But everything points to it being staged. Someone planted evidence, someone else removed footage, and now we have fingerprints that belong to a ghost. He pointed to a narrow corridor of the city, an area lined with old storage units and rundown apartment blocks. The factory is here, but the pattern of movement we traced from witness statements places our unknown subject repeatedly in this zone. 3 sightings in one night from 3 different people who don't know each other. Either that's coincidence, or someone is getting sloppy. Officer Mira stepped forward. Or they want to be seen, she suggested, her voice steady but curious. Sometimes people trail breadcrumbs on purpose. Armin considered that. If their mysterious ghost wanted attention, then they were playing a game, one with rules only they understood. He turned back to the team. We split into pairs and sweep the area. Quietly. Whoever this is, they are confident enough to return to the same stretch of road more than once. The team dispersed. Within half an hour, Armin and Mira were driving through the dim lanes of the storage district, their headlights carving thin paths through the fog. The air smelled like damp cement and something metallic, as if the scent of old machinery had seeped into the soil itself. Rows of units stretched endlessly, each one identical, each one locked, each one capable of hiding secrets the city had forgotten. Mira scanned the surroundings. If someone wanted to hide, they'd pick a place like this, she said. Too many corners. Too many blind spots. Armin nodded, though his thoughts were racing elsewhere. He kept replaying the erased footage. Erasing video required access, tools, and time. Whoever did it either worked fast or had insider knowledge. Maybe both. The car slowed as they approached Unit 47. The door was slightly ajar. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make Armin's instincts flay. He motioned for Mira to stay alert. They stepped out quietly, the gravel crunching faintly under their shoes. Armin pushed the door open with the tip of his boot. The unit was engulfed in darkness except for a faint red glow coming from the back. A laptop screen. Someone had left it open. Mira's breath caught. This feels wrong, she whispered. Armin agreed. The air felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. He approached the laptop cautiously. It displayed a single window, live security footage from inside the police precinct. The interrogation room. Another window popped up, showing the operations room. Then the hallway. Someone was watching them in real time. Mira backed away, her voice trembling. How long has this been here? Before Armin could answer, a soft beeping began from somewhere above them. Not rapid, not frantic. Slow, deliberate. A countdown. Armin grabbed Mira and pushed her toward the door. Out, he shouted. They sprinted out of the unit, diving behind the car just as a muffled explosion shook the ground. Dust and fragments burst into the air, and a shockwave rippled through the rows of units. They coughed, eyes burning, ears ringing. The entire front of Unit 47 was now a twisted, smoking ruin. Someone had planted the laptop intentionally, knowing they would find it. It was bait, and they had fallen for it. Armin steadied himself and stared at the smoke rising into the night sky. This was a warning, he muttered. Whoever we're dealing with didn't just erase footage. They're inside the system. They're watching every step we take. Mira looked at him, fear flickering through her eyes. How do we fight someone who knows everything we're doing before we do it? Armin didn't answer. For the first time since the case began, he felt the cold shiver of uncertainty crawl down his spine. The enemy wasn't hiding. The enemy was circling them, always just out of sight, always close enough to strike. And the worst part was that Armin could no longer tell if they were hunting a killer, or if the killer had started hunting them. The sun had not yet risen when Armin stepped outside his apartment, but the sky carried the faint promise of morning. A thin layer of mist clung to the streets, softening the outlines of buildings and stretching shadows long across the pavement. Yet nothing about the calm dawn eased his mind. Sleep had eluded him entirely. The explosion at Unit 47 replayed in fragments, like broken film caught in a looping projector. Every detail nagged him, every unanswered question pushing deeper into his thoughts. The enemy they were facing was no longer an elusive figure working from the dark. They were bold, calculated, and dangerously close. Too close. As he drove toward the precinct, the city slowly stayed awake, unaware of the threat lurking beneath its ordinary rhythms. Armin's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he considered what the laptop had shown. Live feeds of their own precinct hallways, interrogation rooms, even the operations center. Someone had breached their systems at a level that should have been impossible. And that meant someone on the inside was helping. When he arrived at the precinct, the building felt different. Not physically, but in atmosphere. Officers moved through the halls with quicker steps, their voices lower than usual. Word of the explosion had spread fast, though Armin had ordered minimal disclosure. Fear had a scent, and it hung thick in the air now. As he entered the operations room, Mira and Ruffy were already there, studying the digital map. New markers blinked on the screen, points of interest discovered overnight. Mira turned as he walked in. "We checked the rubble," she said quietly. "Whoever set up the laptop wiped the hard drive clean. No fingerprints, no trace DNA. They knew exactly what they were doing." Armin stared at the map without really seeing it. "They wanted us to find it," he replied. "They wanted us to know they were watching." Ruffy swallowed. "Which means they are confident, almost arrogant." "Or a heist," Mira added. "People don't pull off something like that unless they've done it before." Armin knew she was right. This wasn't the killer's first game. Maybe not even their second. A pattern was emerging, though it shifted every time he reached for it. He motioned for the team to gather around. "Last night's attack wasn't an attempt to harm us," he said. "It was a distraction, or a demonstration. They are telling us they control the narrative. But they slipped one time. They left fingerprints at the factory. Prints that don't match anyone. Ghost or not, someone made a mistake." Mira tapped the screen, zooming into the industrial zone. "There's one place we haven't checked thoroughly yet," she said. "The water treatment plant. It's been inactive for years, and it's close to the factory. Our unknown subject might be using it as a hideout." Armin considered it. The plant had come up briefly in early reports, dismissed because it had no direct tie to the victim. But now patterns were shifting. The killer's movements weren't tied to the victim anymore. They were tied to the investigation. "We go now," Armin decided. Quietly. Only the three of us. Within minutes, they were in an unmarked car heading toward the outskirts. The city's skyline faded behind them, replaced by open land and rusted fencing. The water treatment plant appeared like a skeleton of concrete and steel, its tall tanks casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of abandonment. They approached slowly. The main gate hung crookedly, swaying slightly in the breeze. Armin drew his flashlight and scanned the ground. Fresh footprints. At least 2 sets. "They're here," he whispered. They moved along the side of the building, stepping carefully through the tall grass. A broken window near the back offered the only entry point. Inside, the plant was silent except for the occasional drip of water echoing from unseen pipes. Armin's flashlight illuminated the dust-filled air, revealing rusted railings, staircases leading to nowhere, and dozens of dark corners where anything, or anyone, could hide. Mira motioned toward a corridor that led deeper into the complex. "This way," she murmured. The corridor opened into a wide chamber filled with old machinery. Large metal tanks lined the walls, some still connected to networks of pipes. And in the center of the room lay something that made all three freeze in place. A chair. A single wooden chair placed perfectly beneath a hanging light. On the seat rested an envelope. Armin approached it cautiously. His pulse hammered in his ears. The envelope had his name written across it in neat block letters. Only his name. Mira exhaled sharply. "They knew you'd come." Armin slid the letter out. The paper inside was crisp, untouched, its message typed, not handwritten. "You're chasing the wrong person. Find the truth before the truth finds you." No signature. No hint. Just a taunt carved into perfect simplicity. Ruffy shook his head in disbelief. "They're mocking us. They're not even trying to hide it." Armin scanned the room again. The chair was spotless, as if someone had placed it only minutes before they arrived. But there was no sound, no movement, no indication that anyone remained inside the plant. Yet the footprints outside had been fresh. Someone was watching them even now. Mira suddenly stiffened. "Detective, look." She pointed toward the far corner of the chamber. A small red light blinked faintly. A camera. Not one installed by the city decades ago. A modern one. Wireless. Compact. Active. Armin's blood ran cold. They were being watched again. He moved toward the camera, but before he could disable it, the light turned off. Whoever was watching had cut the feed. They are playing with us, Mira whispered. Every step we take, they are already 3 steps ahead. Armin picked up the chair, examining it. A small symbol was etched under the seat, a triangle divided into 3 segments. It wasn't a gang symbol, not a company logo. Something else. Something intentional. Ruffy, Armin said, run this symbol through every database. Local, national, private, anything. I want to know where it's from. Ruffy nodded and hurried outside to set up a remote scan. Armin stood still, letting the silence seep into his understanding. This wasn't the work of a lone killer. This was an operation. Structured, intelligent, coordinated. But what did they want? What was the endgame? As they exited the plant, Armin felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. He looked up at the broken windows, the empty doorways, the rooftops, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement. Nothing. But the feeling remained. It followed him back to the car. It followed him all the way to the precinct. Hours later, as evening settled in again, Ruffy rushed into Armin's office. "We found something," he panted. "That symbol, it matches an old abandoned organization. A private intelligence group from nearly 2 decades ago. They specialized in surveillance, infiltration, digital warfare. They were shut down for illegal operations, but most of their members vanished." Armin felt the pieces shifting into place. "You think they resurfaced?" "Not all of them," Ruffy said. "But one. Or a faction. And they're involved in this." Armin leaned back, his thoughts swirling. A rogue intelligence operative. A ghost trained to dissipate. Someone who understood surveillance better than the police themselves. Someone who could erase footage, leave false trails, manipulate evidence, and detonate a distraction without breaking pattern. Someone who left a message not to scare them, but to steer them. Why? Armin murmured to himself. What do they gain? But no answer came. Only the echo of the typed words. Find the truth before the truth finds you. As night deepened outside, Armin realized something chilling. The killer wasn't hiding from them. The killer was guiding them some way. And chapter by chapter, step by step, Armin was running out of time to discover where that path led, and what awaited him at the end of it. Detective Laura Price had never felt fear like this before. The past weeks had worn her down, but nothing compared to the gnawing unease that settled over her the night Daniel Rourke vanished from the safe house. She had thought she could protect him, thought that placing him in a secluded location with officers stationed outside would keep him out of danger. But the universe had other plans. The safe house was on the outskirts of a small town, far from Mapleford, surrounded by dense trees and a narrow dirt road that twisted like a serpent. The property was isolated, easy to defend, and yet almost impossible to escape unnoticed if someone truly wanted in. Laura had coordinated with her team to maintain a constant watch. Cameras were installed, patrols were scheduled, and every window and door was secured. The first night had passed quietly, almost deceptively so. But the second night had begun with an unusual silence, a tension that seemed heavier than the usual stillness of night. At exactly 3:20 a.m., one of the cameras briefly flickered off. Only 12 seconds, but 12 seconds that felt like eternity to Laura as she monitored the feed in the operations room. When the signal returned, she froze. Daniel was gone. The bed was empty. The blanket had been neatly folded, but there was no trace of him inside the house. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside. No alarms had been triggered. Nothing had been disturbed, not even the slight creak of the floorboards. The officers stationed outside had seen nothing. No shadows moving in the darkness. No footprints leading away from the house. No vehicle. Nothing. Laura stayed at the screens in disbelief. She could not comprehend how a man could simply vanish. The rational part of her mind wanted to insist it was impossible. Yet her gut screamed that it had happened. Daniel Rourke, the man everyone believed had died once, had disappeared entirely, leaving only questions and fear in his wake. A week later, a fisherman on a remote stretch of the river called in a report. Something, or someone, was floating in the water. When officers arrived, the body was retrieved carefully, and all identification methods were applied. Dental records confirmed it. Fingerprints matched the original case files. The man was Daniel Rourke. This time, there could be no doubt. He had truly died. And yet, the more Laura considered the evidence, the stranger it all became. How had he vanished from a locked, monitored house, only to appear dead days later in a river hundreds of miles away. How had anyone managed this with such precision? Was it someone connected to the Northbridge network? Or was it a new player entirely? As the investigation into the body proceeded, Laura discovered another disturbing detail. Inside Daniel's pockets, beneath the soaked clothing, was a single folded note. She carefully unfolded it, expecting a clue to the murderer, a name, a threat, or perhaps some message from Daniel himself. Instead, there was only one sentence: "Some ghosts don't stay buried." The words were typed perfectly, not a smudge in sight, no trace of moisture, yet the paper had survived the river's current completely intact. Laura felt a chill that ran deeper than the autumn wind that swept through Mapleford streets. This was not just a murder. This was a statement. Someone had orchestrated the entire sequence with meticulous care. Someone had ensured that Daniel's death would carry an additional layer of mystery, almost as if to send a message to anyone investigating. The town was in shock again, though few understood the full complexity. Locals whispered about Daniel Rourke, the man who had died twice. Some said he was cursed. Others claimed he had been involved in dark dealings that had finally caught up with him. But no one could explain the impossibility of his disappearance from a guarded house. No one could reconcile the first death at Black Pine Lake with the second discovery in the river. The media jumped on the story immediately. Newspapers, online outlets, and television reports splashed headlines across the nation. "The man who died twice. Mapleford mystery deepens. Unexplained disappearance ends in death." Laura sat at her desk for hours, reading through articles that speculated wildly about Daniel's life, his connections, and his possible double life. None of them touched the truth. Daniel's secrets were far deeper than anyone suspected. Laura knew that Daniel had not been the simple accountant the town remembered. The second death confirmed it. Someone with extraordinary skill and resources had orchestrated his final disappearance. She spent days retracing steps, speaking to officers, checking the safe house, and reviewing all surveillance footage again. Every detail was examined, every theory considered, but nothing explained how Daniel could be in one place, under constant watch, and then end up in the river with no physical evidence of movement or transportation. The possibilities were terrifying. Laura considered that Daniel's life had been filled with unseen enemies, powerful enough to manipulate events in ways ordinary humans could not. His involvement with Northbridge Holdings, the secret bank accounts, the passports, and his hidden storage unit suggested a network that extended far beyond Mapleford. And perhaps someone from that network had decided his life had become too dangerous to leave alive, or perhaps too threatening to allow to survive the first disappearance. Detective Price began to wonder if she had ever truly known Daniel at all. The man she had spent weeks trying to protect, questioning, and uncovering had lived a life in shadows, filled with secrets that not even she could fully comprehend. And yet, the note in his pocket, the final message, seemed to speak directly to her. Some ghosts don't stay buried. Was Daniel a ghost? Or had someone else become one, using him as a pawn to send a final message? Weeks passed, and Mapleford began to accept what had happened, though uneasily. The story was covered, debated, and eventually grew quiet as people returned to their routines. But Laura could not rest. She continued to investigate the second death, determined to understand how it had been orchestrated, and why. During one late-night session at the precinct, she reviewed the storage unit files Daniel had left behind. Each folder, each passport, each transaction record was scrutinized. A pattern emerged, subtle but undeniable. Daniel had been living in a constant cycle of identity change, one that required precision, timing, and awareness of threats. Whoever had taken him, or ensured his second death, had the knowledge and capability to navigate that world. This was not an ordinary killer. This was someone trained, methodical, and ruthless. The river where Daniel's body was found offered little in the way of clues. Water eroded evidence, blurred details, and erased the marks of human activity. The autopsy provided confirmation of death, but little else. The injury pattern suggested he had been struck, perhaps sedated, and transported carefully to ensure minimal trace of handling. Even the most meticulous investigators struggled to reconstruct the process. Laura felt the frustration weigh on her. The case had shifted from a murder investigation to a puzzle of impossible logistics. And at the center was Daniel Rourke, whose life had been a carefully constructed illusion. She visited the river a week after the body was found, standing at the edge and staring at the current. The water moved silently, carrying remnants of leaves, branches, and debris downstream. Laura imagined Daniel there, in that current, and the impossibility of his journey through the night played over and over in her mind. How could anyone plan such a precise disappearance? How could someone ensure a body would be found in such a way to confirm identity, yet maintain an air of mystery and terror? Who had orchestrated it? And why leave a note so cryptic, almost taunting? The thought lingered with her long after she left the riverbank. Over the next several months, Laura pieced together the known facts, interviewed neighbors, analyzed every transaction, and revisited every sighting of the man walking after the first death. Each revelation seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Daniel's life had been double, secret, and dangerous. His first death had been a misdirection, his second, a final confirmation. And the note suggested that even in death, someone, or something, remained in control. The case was officially closed by the precinct, marked as a homicide with unknown perpetrators. Yet Laura knew the truth was far more complicated. Mapleford residents whispered for years about the man who had died twice. Some said they had seen him walking in the fog at Hartley Bridge. Others claimed to have glimpsed a shadowy figure standing silently at the edge of the lake at night. Laura knew what she knew. Daniel Rourke had lived a life full of secrets, and the network that surrounded him was powerful enough to make a man disappear twice. But one detail remained unanswered. Who had orchestrated the second death? The note in his pocket, perfectly preserved, remained the final clue. And the words echoed in her mind relentlessly. Some ghosts don't stay buried. As autumn turned to winter, the memory of Daniel Rourke haunted the town, not as a man, but as a story, a puzzle, a warning. Residents would speak of him in hushed tones, unsure whether to fear him, his enemies, or the shadows that might still linger. And every so often, locals claimed to see a tall, silent figure standing on Hartley Bridge at dawn, staring into the mist as if waiting for something, or someone. Laura never saw him there, but she felt his presence in every step of the investigation, in every folder she opened, in every unexplained occurrence. Daniel Rourke was gone, yet he remained everywhere. The man who had died twice had become more than a case, more than a mystery. He had become a legend, a ghost whose secrets and shadows would never be fully understood. And for Laura Price, the investigation into his life and death was far from over, even if the world chose to forget.